Hi, everyone. I'm Amay Latour, a staff writer at Ballotpedia on the Marquee team. Thanks for being here today. We just released our 11th annual report looking at competitiveness in state legislative elections. This year's report focuses on just 3 legislative chambers out of the 99, since only 3 are holding elections in 2021. We're following the 220 state legislative seats up for election in the New Jersey State Senate and General Assembly and the Virginia House of Delegates. This was a record year and at least one indicator of competitiveness, which is major party competition, since we started publishing the report 11 years ago. Here to talk with me about that and a lot more is my coworker and teammate on the Marquee team, Doug Cronazel, who authored this year's report and last year's as well. Hi, Doug. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start with some basics. What is the competitiveness report?
Yeah, the competitiveness report is a way for us to closely analyze state legislative elections each year. We want to have a standardized way to more or less keep a finger on the pulse of these elections so that we can make comparisons and spot when things are heating up in a chamber or when one election cycle is above or below the average. It's not the perfect analogy, but you might think of it like a report card where we have several criteria we examine in order to calculate an overall competitiveness index each year.
Okay, and we use the term competitive in a specific way in this report, right? When I read about a competitive election, I tend to think of something like a neck and neck race, maybe one with like a narrow margin of victory, but that's not how we define it here, right?
Yeah, that's right. We don't focus on specific battleground races and specific districts. Instead, our competitiveness report takes a broader look at all state legislative elections to determine how much competition there was throughout the election cycle. Was this a cycle when people turned out in droves to run for office and compete against each other, or was it quieter? Did voters have more choices or fewer?
All right, well, thanks. So let's talk about the methodology then to get an understanding of where this measurement of competitiveness comes from. You mentioned we use several criteria, so tell us about those.
Yeah, we use 3 criteria to determine an election cycle's competitiveness. They're designed to give us snapshots at the start, middle, and end of the election cycle. So first, we want to know the number of open seats, which are seats where the incumbent did not seek re-election at all.
Okay, and so having more open seats would result in higher competitiveness, right?
Yeah, exactly. Elections for open seats tend to draw out more candidates, plus you don't have the incumbency effect present in the race, so that would also increase competitiveness.
Okay, so open seats, that's the first criteria. What about the others?
Yeah, next we jump forward and we look at the primary elections. For those incumbents who are seeking re-election, how many are being challenged in primary elections?
Sure, because if an incumbent is not facing a primary challenge, they advance directly to the general election without that added layer of competition.
Yeah, so the more incumbents there are facing primaries, the more competitive the election cycle becomes because it's adding that extra layer of choice into the cycle. And then the last criterion is major party competition.
And by major party, we're talking about Democrats and Republicans.
Exactly. We want to know how many seats are being contested by both a Democrat and a Republican. Or you can think of it this way, if you were a voter in this district, could you choose between either a Democrat or a Republican? If so, then you've got major party competition.
And if not, does that mean the seat will likely be won by one major party or the other without any competition at all on the general election ballot?
Yeah, that's what it typically tends to mean because it's not a perfect metric because we don't take into account third party or independent candidates. But for the most part, it gives us a really helpful snapshot of how many of these general election races are being contested by those major parties.
All right, so open seats, incumbents in primaries, and major party competition. Those are the 3 criteria we use to gauge competitiveness. So what do we do with that data?
Well, once we've collected all that data, which like I just said, we're doing it all year long, we combine those criteria as percentages to develop a competitiveness index. And so this index is a standalone figure that's meant to represent the competitiveness of a given election cycle, or you could look at a state or a chamber. It ranges from 1 to 100, with 1 meaning least competitive and 100 meaning most.
All right, great. So let's start by digging into some of those criteria.
Sure thing. Let's start with open seats. Of the 220 seats that were up for election this year, 203 incumbents filed for re-election. That's right around 92% of all incumbents up for election this year. Of those 17 incumbents who did not run for re-election, 7 were Democrats and 10 were Republicans.
17 out of 220 seems pretty low. Do we know how that compares to previous election cycles?
Yep, we do. Those 17 incumbents represent 7.7% of all incumbents up for election in 2021. So that's actually the lowest rate of open seats in a given odd year election cycle since 2013, when 6.8% of incumbents left their seats open.
That is interesting. And I see we have higher percentages of open seats, kind of a pattern, 2011, 2015, and 2019. And lower percentages in 2013, 2017, and then this year, 2021. Any reason why that might be the case?
Well, so in 2011, 2015, and 2019, those peak cycles, you had elections in Mississippi and Louisiana, as well as New Jersey and Virginia. That alone wouldn't necessarily change the percentages, but Louisiana has term limits, which means every election cycle, there's typically some number of legislators who can't seek re-election. So this next chart, this is showing the raw number of open seats in each election cycle. The brown bars represent incumbents who were not term limited, and the yellow shows those that were term limited.
Okay, so 2019, for example, a little under half of all open seats were caused by term limits. But then in New Jersey and Virginia, we don't see term limits there, so we're only going to see those voluntary open seats.
Yep, exactly. So in New Jersey and Virginia, a seat is typically only left open when an incumbent chooses not to seek re-election. In states with term limits, those term limits can cause you not to seek re-election.
Okay, and so after the open seats, we look at incumbents in contested primaries. What were those numbers like this year?
Yeah, so of those 203 incumbents who filed for re-election, about 80% advanced to the general election without facing a contested primary. The remaining 20%, which are those 23 Democrats and 17 Republicans, they had contested primaries.
And of the 2 states holding elections, did one see more contested primaries than the other?
It's helpful to look at it through a party lens. So a larger percentage of Democratic incumbents faced contested primaries in Virginia, while Republican incumbents had contested primaries at a higher rate in New Jersey.
Okay, any reasons for those divides?
Well, in Virginia, for example, local parties decide whether they will select candidates through primaries, which are held as a public vote, or through conventions, which typically involve delegates or pledged votes. In 2021, 25 candidates in Virginia were selected through conventions, 9 Democrats and 16 Republicans. And so we don't include contested conventions in our contested primaries analysis. So that might have had an effect that maybe brings down the number of the percentage of Republican incumbents in contested primaries, for example. That could have an effect.
All right, but so altogether, about 1 in 5 incumbents who filed for re-election faced a contested primary. How does that compare to previous election cycles? Is it higher or lower than usual?
Well, the rate of incumbents in contested primaries has actually been increasing gradually over the past decade. As you can see from this chart, the 20% in 2021 was the 3rd highest rate in the past 10 years.
Okay, well, thank you. So before we move on to talk about major party competition, I want to ask, a contested primary is an election like any other. Some candidates win, some lose. What do we know about the outcomes of these contested primaries in 2021? How did incumbents do against their challengers?
Well, that's a great question. 8 incumbents, 5 Democrats and 3 Republicans lost in contested primaries this year. That's about 4% of all incumbents who filed for re-election and 20% of all incumbents who faced contested primaries.
Wow, so that chart is showing general election and primary election defeats in the 3 chambers holding elections this year. And it looks like 8 defeats is pretty high.
Yeah, it is. Before 2021, the most incumbents who were defeated in primaries in these chambers was 2. In fact, in 2011 and 2017, no incumbents lost in primaries. So with 8 defeats, 2021 is already tied for the second most incumbents defeated in these chambers. And that's before the general elections have even taken place.
Right. So who are these incumbents? What do we know about them?
Well, we've got a list here that we can show you. In New Jersey, for example, you've got a Democrat and 2 Republicans. In Virginia, you've got 4 Democrats and 1 Republican. As far as what we know about them, some interesting things in New Jersey, for instance, Assemblyman Chiaravallati, he actually unofficially withdrew from his primary.
So he dropped out of the race, but his name appeared on the ballot still, right?
Yep. And so since his name was on the ballot, we still count that as an incumbent defeated in a primary, even though he had dropped out beforehand. And then there were also some interesting developments in Virginia where we had those 4 Democrats and 1 Republican, Democrats losing in higher numbers. 2 of those House incumbents, delegates Lee Carter and Mark Levine, they were actually running for statewide office while also running for the re-election to their House seats. Carter was running for governor while Levine was running for lieutenant governor. And then another interesting tidbit, another one of the Democratic delegates, Steve Heretic, he lost to Nadarius Clark in his primary. He was actually first elected in 2015 after he himself defeated his predecessor in the Democratic primary.
Oh, interesting insights there. And these are just the primaries, so we'll have to check back later to see how the general elections turn out. Speaking of general elections, let's take a look at that last criterion, major party competition. What does that look like in 2021?
Well, like you mentioned at the start of the talk, that is where the 2020 elections really have broken away from the pack. We're seeing a decade high rate of major party competition. Of those 220 seats up for election, about 205, 93%, are being contested by Democrats and Republicans. Of the remaining 15, 10 are being contested only by Democrats and 5 only by Republicans. This is actually the first election cycle since 2011 where over 90% of state legislative seats up for election were contested by both major parties.
That is a high percentage. Do we know what it is about 2021 that makes that the case?
Well, let's start with taking a look at New Jersey, because elections in the state have had a pretty high rate of major party competition throughout the past decade in both the Senate and the General Assembly. As you can see, Democrats are contesting every seat up for election in New Jersey, which is something they've done every election cycle since 2017.
Right, and it looks like Republicans have been contesting a lot of seats as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in 2021, Republicans are actually contesting their smallest percentage of seats in New Jersey statewide, but that smallest percentage is still 112 out of the 120 seats up for election. So that's roughly 93% of those up for election in New Jersey. So still quite a high percentage.
Right. So New Jersey just seems to always have a pretty high level of major party competition going on in these races. And I'm assuming that means the increases we're seeing in 2021 must all have come from Virginia, right?
Yep, precisely. Increased competition in 2021 was largely driven by competition in the Virginia House of Delegates. So look at this graph here. In 2011, 41 seats, less than half of those up for election in the chamber, were contested by both major parties. That increased to 93 in 2021, a 127% increase over the decade.
Right, and during that time, we've seen some pretty big elections in Virginia. In 2019, for example, Democrats won control of the House of Delegates for the first time in 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So this is one of the ways when taken and compared over time, we see that our competitiveness analysis gives us an additional angle into some of these other political stories and trends that we watch or keep an eye on each year.
Right. Well, thank you. So just to recap, in 2021, we had a lower percentage of open seats, a higher percentage of incumbents and contested primaries, and a decade high percentage of major party competition. So with all that, I'm guessing the competitiveness index will be higher than average this year.
You are correct. In fact, the competitiveness index in 2021 was 40.2, and that's the highest competitiveness index we have ever recorded in any election cycle, odd or even year, since we began our analysis over a decade ago.
All right, so according to our competitiveness analysis, the 220 seats up for election this year are the most competitive we've recorded. Very cool.
Yeah, it is. And it looks like this decade high was very much driven by that marked increase in major party competition in the Virginia House of Delegates. But the uptick in incumbents facing contested primaries also helped. But basically, our analysis has shown us that when it comes to choices on the ballot, state legislative elections of 2021 are presenting plenty of them.
All right, well, I'm sure we'll have more analyses along these lines to come.
Yes, and if you enjoyed learning about our competitiveness analysis, the report, or you want to dig into the facts and figures more deeply, check it out. Check out the report online on our website. We've got historical analyses. You can go through previous year reports, and there's a lot of really interesting context in there.
Definitely. Well, we also invited readers to submit questions ahead of today's briefing. So before we sign off, Doug, I wanted to ask a couple questions. First, 220 state legislative seats is on the lower end of what we cover each year. So how does 2021 compare to the most recent even year election cycle, which was 2020?
Yeah, that's a great question. In 2020, we covered 5,875 seats in our competitiveness report. So definitely a little bit higher than 220. But that's one reason why we try to look at things through percentages when possible. The competitiveness index for 2020 was 33.5, which was lower than average over the preceding decade.
Sure, and but like we saw with 2021, some of the measures might be higher and others might be lower. Did any of the metrics stand out from 2020?
Well, for even year elections, 2020 had the lowest percentage of open seats, 14.9%. Now, as we know, we just went over 2021, that's higher than this year. But for even year elections, it gave us the most incumbents seeking re-election in at least a decade. And stemming from our conversation earlier, it looks like that downtick was caused by a decrease in term limited legislators in 2020. There just weren't a lot of legislators whose term limits were kicking in compared to previous election cycles. So maybe that'll be different in 2022 and looking forward.
Well, all right, thanks. One more question. 2022 is right around the corner. Based on what we know about previous election cycles, what can we expect from the next election cycle?
Yeah, 2022 will be unique. Remember that right now states are working with census data to redistrict both congressional and state legislative district lines. So typically the election cycle right after redistricting sees an increase in incumbents in contested primaries.
I'm assuming that has something to do with redrawn district lines?
Yep, it does indeed. So during the redistricting process, it is not uncommon for an incumbent to suddenly find him or herself living in a different district that's represented by a different incumbent. So if both of those incumbents choose to seek re-election, suddenly you've got two incumbents contesting each other in a primary in that district.
Sure, because rather than an incumbent being contested in a primary by challengers, you might have an incumbent contested by another incumbent.
Yep. And so we count that as a contested primary for both incumbents, which definitely increases the numbers a little bit. It happens in other election cycles now and again, if an incumbent moves and wants to run for re-election into this new district that they moved into, but it's definitely most prevalent in the election cycle following redistricting.
Right. Well, great. Thanks for being here, Doug, and for walking us through the report.
Well, thank you very much.
And I also want to thank Sarah Grote, our communications associate, for the visual presentation that was part of today's briefing. Along with state legislative elections, Ballotpedia is covering elections at many levels of government happening in 2021. New Jersey and Virginia are also holding elections for governor, for example. We're following those very closely. We're also covering elections for mayor, city council, and school board happening across the country. And you can find our coverage at ballotpedia.org and in our newsletters, The Daily Brew and The Tap. I also invite you to join me on October 6th for a briefing on some of the most interesting elections happening in November. You can sign up for that on our page called Ballotpedia Events. We hope you found today's briefing valuable, and I invite you to support our work if you're able by going to ballotpedia.org/donate. Thanks again for being here and take care.